The traffickers are back in the sentence. And now it's your chance to ask questions. I know that if we dismissed right now, there would be a line, but we want all of you to have a chance to ask your questions. You go to slido.com on any kind of cell phone device, whatever you have, and put in N442, and you will have access to ask your questions. Now, this is a Q&A tool that is based on social media. If you like somebody else's question, click like, and it goes to the top. It goes to the top. So while you're asking your questions and the ambassador is getting a drink of water, I get to ask the first question because I have the microphone. So your presentation on government and how we can really be advocates at the very beginning, if I were giving you guys an exam, that would be the place to start. So what would you say to students who want to do something that will make impact? We're done with awareness. We want to be actors in ending human trafficking. What will you say to my students?
I think there are a couple things when it comes from a student perspective of what to do. And my first thought is probably going to fall a bit flat. Honestly, the best thing you can do as students is crush your classes. Is absolutely become excellent in every subject that you're taking. Like, soak deep of the opportunity to actually be a student and to study. Because what we need are really, really talented people engaged in this fight. You know, all the time I'll hear people say, I want to go like counsel a survivor. I'm like, well, that's really interesting. Tell me about why. Like, I really care. I'm like, tell me about like what your experience has been. And they have none. I'm like, you know, these survivors don't need just like nice people to lend an ear. They need trauma-informed, trained, thoughtful people who really know how to love them and how to care for them. Look, likewise, we need FBI agents. We need Homeland Security agents, like really talented investigators. We need forensic accountants. We need some lawyers. I like lawyers. We need a few prosecutors out there. We need some people with MSWs. We need some people who can go. And so it's not that you have to have a ton of credentials to help. But if you're a student, I would think master your content now. The second thought I have for students is stay connected, stay involved, and look for opportunities that are close by. Right? The anti-trafficking world, the subculture that we get to live in is a pretty small place. Like coming to conferences, meeting people, getting to know, looking for opportunities to connect to different types of intervention plans are out there. And I try lots of different ones. Different organizations, different nonprofits have different philosophies. Engage with them. Figure out, like compare them. Think about how you would view them. I think that can be incredibly helpful in getting a textured view of the anti-trafficking movement and give you relationships to help you figure out where to plug in and connect in the future.
Write that down. Okay, 17 likes for this question. You guys caught on to this fast. What are warning signs to look for in elementary level students?
You know, I would think there are probably several people in this room who would be much better at answering that question than me. I just want to confess on the front end. But I would say indicators of trauma, right? And I think as we see indicators of trauma, people who are withdrawing, people who are engaging differently than they normally do, people who are having difficulty, we don't know what might be the generator of that trauma. It could be trafficking, it could be something else, but those kids are probably in need of help. And so I think what would be most helpful is for people in elementary schools as well as other places to just be aware of the challenges that the people around them are facing, be open to thinking through what could be the causes of those challenges, and then figure out how do I refer those folks to talented professionals in each of those fields, right? So if it's a child endangerment piece, or if it's a neglect piece, or if it's a trafficking piece, or abuse piece, those might go to different locations. But being aware of how people are responding and reacting and where we see signs of trauma, I think it's really important.
What is a good way to approach students you suspect are victims of human trafficking without scaring or offending them?
You know, part of this trauma-informed piece is is that we approach people where they are, but we approach people with dignity, and we approach it slowly sometimes. And I think before you go approach someone directly about trafficking, you might want to talk to others. You might want to talk to some counselors, some other folks who might be aware of what's going on. Drawing people into a broader community and a conversation about how to protect and love others, I think is essential.
Here's a great one. This one you'll like. What potential criminal charges? See, he's an attorney. He's all excited now about answering this one. What potential criminal charges are placed on minors who are coercing other minors into trafficking? Are there interventions?
Where minors are the traffickers. Well, the first thing I would say here is that we want to make sure that we never prosecute victims for the unlawful conduct their traffickers compel them to commit, right? Of any type, minors, adults, or whatever. Like, we want to make sure that we believe in this principle of non-prosecution of victims, non-penalization of victims at every turn. It's a challenging circumstance when kids themselves are the perpetrators, right? The first thing I would look for is, honestly, if they really are the perpetrator or if someone else is actually controlling them. That would be my first line of inquiry. If by investigating the facts, I really determine with law enforcement that, nope, there is no one else out there, then you're into the when children are in conflict with the law situation. And of course, kids do commit crimes, larceny, theft of different types, so sexual offenses that kids could commit, and we have juvenile courts that kind of walk through that. The offenses are often the same, but the way they are handled administratively by the court system are frequently different. Right? So you might have a human trafficking offense per se, but it's going to be handled in the juvenile courts, probably not the adult courts. Because this is a state law issue and you are all from California and I got my law degree in Bard in Virginia, I should probably not talk about how California works. But I think there are folks here who might be able to help you figure that out. But my first inclination would be, how do we make sure we don't prosecute the victims, and is there someone else controlling the child you think is the perpetrator?
Social media is one of the largest methods to identify victims. What are we doing to hold social media platforms accountable from a liability perspective?
I mean, social media is a medium, right? I mean, like, good things can happen on social media, bad things can happen on social media. Traffickers are using social media to find victims, to recruit and groom them, to find customers. Law enforcement is using social media to identify victims and to gather evidence that they can use at trial to corroborate the victims so we don't have to rely on their testimony. All those things are out there. So social media itself, I don't think is a harm. I think instead it's a medium, and good things or bad things could happen on that medium. I will tell you that last year there was a new piece of federal legislation that focused on content providers and whether or not they could have the safe harbor from the Communications Decency Act. Now, that law is brand new, that sort of removed the safe harbor. The most notable kind of case that surrounded this and that motivated the proponents for this legislation was Backpage.com. It was never used to attack Backpage.com because prosecutors in Arizona took it down and indicted them a few weeks right after the bill passed. But there are some legislative tools that have removed barriers if somebody wants to bring a civil or criminal case against an internet service provider or some sort of platform. But I think the question really becomes, are they actually engaged in the trafficking, or are they just sort of a bulletin board or someplace where people are putting things up? And we can decide as a culture, as we enter this new technology, what sort of burdens and responsibilities do we want to place on these providers, on these platforms? And I think as a culture, we haven't decided that yet. I think that's a policy decision that's going to be ripe over the next 10 years.
Good point. What is being done to change the risk-reward dynamic so traffickers get out of the business or are reluctant to enter?
This goes to the issue of impunity. The traffickers that I have met are not reluctant at all to enter this business. Now, I've run the numbers, and you're more likely to get struck by lightning than prosecuted for running a trafficking operation. Right? I mean, it's stunning. And so how worried are you about getting struck by lightning? Like, even in a thunderstorm, it never crosses my mind. And so traffickers operate with impunity. And they do it because they're motivated by money. Like, I think it's important to remember that at its heart, this is an economically motivated crime. It doesn't mean they don't have other motivations too. They can be hateful people, they can have other issues, but there's always a component of economic motivation. And so if we do not either increase the risk for traffickers by the chance of criminal or civil accountability, or we do not make it more difficult for them to make money from these operations, they will continue. And it cannot be enough just to care for survivors, right? We have to do all of it. So when I hear people say, you know what, there's too much focus on prosecution, I'm thinking, how can that be when we're prosecuting so few people? What they say is like, don't just do prosecution, which I'm thinking, totally don't just do prosecution. You got to do protection and prevention as well. But you can't leave any of those P's out. But there's been great continuity of thought, I think, in this area, where we have to do prosecution, protection, and prevention at the same time. These are not three different silos. These are sort of woven together, three cords of the same rope.
What motivated you to focus your career on human trafficking prevention?
Wow. You know, and I don't quite know how to answer that question, because unlike your students, I did not go to college and think, I really want to do this. I didn't even know about it. There was no sort of conversation in kind of my college or in my universities about trafficking in persons. It just hadn't come on the scene yet. I knew I wanted to do a couple things, though. I knew I was interested in systems and making them better, and I knew I was interested in justice, right? And justice, you know, my philosophy professor in college bent himself into intellectual pretzels trying to understand what justice was, and I don't know why. It's so simple. Like, justice is just making wrong things right. It's seeing something wrong and working to make it right. Big things, little things, local things, global things. It can happen in any sphere. I was interested in that. I was interested in this idea of, could we use systems to make wrong things right? When I learned about trafficking, I was already practicing law in a law firm, and I went to India, began to be exposed to this, and people would, when I came back, people would say, you just must have a heart for India and a heart for trafficking. I'm thinking, no, I have a heart for barbecue and a heart for football. What I realized, though, is that there's something so much bigger out there, this idea of human dignity, and that freedom is the first freedom, right? Like, if you're not free, if freedom doesn't come first, then your right to speak, your right to assemble, your right to worship where you want, you never get to exercise them, right? Freedom is first. And this idea that there were millions of people who were sidelined, millions of people who don't get to make the most basic decisions about their lives. They wake up and someone else decides kind of what they do, where they work, and who touches their bodies. That denies them that basic core inherent right. And I just thought, like, this is more interesting than what I was doing at my law firm. Could we be a part of that? Could we be a part of bringing hope to people and making wrong things right in that area?
You said we can send tips for the tip report. What kind of information is useful? Trends? How do we support what we see with evidence that makes a difference?
I love that question, because what we want to do is know what's actually going on, right? As we think about the U.S. narrative, as we think about making recommendations for improvement, the trends you see, absolutely. How traffickers are adjusting their schemes. New tools that you think have been particularly helpful. Adjustments that you've made to your own programs to deal with some of the challenges that come up would all be helpful. Ways the government is lacking, where we're failing, where we need to do better. You all see them. We're okay with criticism, right? Like, we get it. We are new in this movement. Like I said, it hasn't even been 20 years yet. We have a lot of runway, a lot of room to grow, and you guys can help us figure out where to do that. So whatever you're experiencing. And if you want to say some nice things to the government, if you want to say, like, good job, we'll hear that too, right? A little affirmation can go a long way. And it's like, you know, go hug an FBI agent. Tell them thank you. All these things can be helpful.
So I could hug the ambassador, right? Yeah, okay. Here's a really great question from my perspective. The anti-human trafficking efforts have been dominated by women trying to find a solution to a problem often driven by men. What would you, as a man, tell other men? Do I need to do some filler stuff for a minute?
No. So, but I'm going to answer that question. But first, can I just say that That's true in sex trafficking, right? But I think in labor trafficking, that analysis might be quite different. I don't think labor trafficking is driven by men. And I think that it's a mistake to leave labor trafficking out of the analysis. That being said, let's just say there's never a line at the men's room at an anti-trafficking event, right? It is remarkable to me that more men are not involved. And so what I would say to men is step up. But I'd say to everybody, to men and women, but particularly to men, like this is an area that really matters. And if all humans have dignity, we want to make sure that we are communicating that. And if this is a place where women are leading, I also want to celebrate that as well. And I think that women's voices and women's leadership matters. So I'm grateful to the men who are here in solidarity. Like, we care. We're going to try and do this work. We're going to call others to it. But I do want to make sure that we are giving a message that doesn't become gender specific, but instead becomes focused on freedom.
Well, all the men in the room, please wave. It's growing. It's growing. Good job. Kenny's good to see you here. Okay, I don't know why this is a competition, but it always comes up. What U.S. state has the highest incidence of trafficking?
If you ask a journalist, they will tell you their state, whatever state they live in.
Absolutely.
What I found most remarkable is the number of cities that said we are the second city for human trafficking around the country. It was like Dayton, Ohio has said it, Florida, a bunch of cities in Florida have said it. It's crazy. Everyone who has an interstate is like, our interstate brings traffickers in. There is this incredible desire to communicate from a media standpoint, it's in our backyard, right? And I get that. I kind of like that idea. It indeed is in everyone's backyards. When I ask them where do they get their information, they always tell me the FBI. So I call my buddies over at the FBI, like, are you ranking cities and states? And they all say, we have never ranked cities and states. So I would say anyone who's telling you that one state has more than another state may be well-intentioned, but is somehow missing the actual analysis. What we can say is which states are doing more cases, like where is law enforcement helping identify more traffickers, or where are NGOs identifying and serving more victims, right? We can count the things we're actually doing, but we as a movement have not figured out prevalence, right? We have not figured out how to measure this invisible crime. We have not figured out how to estimate the number of victims. But what I would say to the people who desperately want better prevalence measures, and I talk to them all the time, the first thing is, I say, I join you. I would love for people to figure out prevalence, because I'm tired of getting the question, right? I would love to figure it out. Here's 2 things that will help us do it. And some of you guys may become the researchers that help us figure it out. It has to be industry specific and geographically restricted. A survey instrument to measure the number of trafficking victims in, say, California is never going to work, because the folks who are forcing people to work in agricultural fields are never going to respond to the same survey as folks who are selling young boys for sex in an urban area, right? There's just a totally different thing. Traffickers don't gather together for trade associations. This is not how it works. So you want to figure out, like, what's the prevalence of domestic workers in this city, right? And tailor an instrument to gather that. And then measure against that after 4 or 5 years after you've done some different interventions. So I think having industry-specific, geographically restricted prevalence estimates could be helpful going forward. The second thing, though, I say is, after I tell them I'm in, I want to figure out prevalence, I'm willing to spend some time on it, I ask them, why? Why do you want to know? Like, no one is suggesting that human trafficking is not exploding. No one is suggesting that there are not plenty of victims, and everywhere we look for victims, we seem to find them. And so I get frustrated sometimes because I feel like no one ever asks me how many gigabytes of child porn exist. No one ever says how many kilos of cocaine exist. We're not trying to quantify the prevalence in other areas of crime to justify the investment of resources to combat it. And so why use a different standard for trafficking? So I want to find out how the prevalence works. I think we can experiment with that and do better. But I also want to make sure we don't wait for a good prevalence estimate before we aggressively combat this crime and put resources towards it.
2 last quick questions, because we only have 1 minute left. Is there a plan for an international hotline?
I have not heard anyone suggest for an international hotline, and my guess would be the reason is it'd be very difficult to operate and make it culturally thoughtful. What we have seen is lots of individual countries or regions within countries establish hotlines as well. And so I think kind of a hotline country by country might end up making more sense than an international one, but I'll leave it to my friends who are experts in hotlines to kind of help walk us through that discussion.
There's been talk about legalizing prostitution. 30 seconds to comment on that, Ambassador.
30 seconds. There indeed has been a conversation about legalizing prostitution.
We'll give you 45.
Oh, shoot. Yeah, I mean, it comes up. We'll see how that develops. We, as a community, get to decide, right? I mean, it's a question. There are countries where commercial sexual activity is legal. In our country, except for 2 counties, it is not. You know, it will be up to the voters. It will be up to the citizens to decide what we want as a community. And I know there are arguments on both sides. I read their papers, and I listen to their voices. There are some really powerful arguments, actually, on both sides. And we're going to have to see what happens. But I would say that conversation is not going away. It is only going to ramp up. And if you have strong feelings about it, I encourage you to participate in that conversation.
Thank you very much.